I'm starting my speech in three, two, one. The problem with forgiveness is that depending on who you're speaking to, it is either an enforced ending or a journey that has no end in sight that justifies or guarantees that individuals are rehabilitated. The stance of opening government in this debate is simple. We think that the predisposition to appointing forgiveness as the main and most desired of outcome when it comes to any kind of conflict or disagreement is bad for three key aspects. First, we're going to talk about victims. The second, we're going to talk about perpetrators. The third, we're going to talk about how society at large interacts with forgiveness to the extent that it makes it not justifiable, something that's not desirable. So the first question I want to ask, what does the current world look like when forgiveness is seen as a virtue? I think this looks like two things. First, it's schools and any type of power structure, whether it's politics, whether it's religion, whether it's financial institutions, they all emphasize forgiveness as a particular thing that every individual should pursue and that every individual should attempt to get at the end of the day. The reason for why this characterization is true is because something being a virtue is very different from it just being desirable. For it to be a virtue, it means society at large has commonly agreed that this is the most preferred outcome for every single dispute. That's why the framing and characterization that this is the outcome that most people are encouraged to go for whenever they are in a conflict is true, and it's correct to be characterized. The second thing, how does the world of opening government differentiate from this status quo? Firstly, we will not demonize forgiveness. Rather, it would just be a neutral form of acceptance or any form of conflict dissolution that we currently have in status quo. So it's not a bad thing. You can pursue it if you want, but there is no predisposition for you going for this particular narrative. The reason why this is very reasonable and a very fair thing to characterize is because most people in status quo view any form of alternative like dispute resolution the same way to begin with. So I think an analogy for this is like the way people go to courts, but the option to settle out of court is also an option. It's not something you have to pursue, but it's something you can do if you want. That's similar to how society in our world will interact with forgiveness. So now let me just go into my argumentation. Let me begin with victims. CO, you have a clarification?
So what are these alternative methods of conflict resolution that you see? So if I don't forgive someone for something they did to me, like what happens?
Okay, thanks. I'll explain that right now in my arguments, actually. So let's talk about victims first. So I think the reason why the narrative that individuals and forgiveness is a virtue is bad for victims is because at every point in interaction, regardless of the crime that occurs, the first thought that occurs to a victim is not how hurt they have been or how scarred they've been from a particular incident, but more often than not, they are oftentimes forced to take on the decision to forgive someone far before they are ready, but also far before they are actually willing to forgive this person to begin with. I have three structural reasons why this particular framing is true. The first thing is that the nature of conflict is such where you know the people that are hurting you, right? More often than not, they are family members, they are friends, they are co-workers, they are all people that you interact with. But society at large also interacts with these individuals as well. So for instance, if an uncle has hurt you for potentially saying things that are quite devastating to your self-esteem, you not forgiving them makes family reunions really awkward for all of the rest of your family. That's why, especially in brown families, there's such a heavy pressure to forgive family members because you just want to actively celebrate and have really good times with these individuals. That's a structural reason why, firstly, individuals just cannot rationally think if they want to forgive someone or not. Now, let me just engage with this a little bit further. The problem then is that when people are just forced and rushed into forgiving because it's the main thing that people must prioritize, this does a couple of things to people. Firstly, they forgive people before they are even ready to do so. This is bad for several reasons. First, you cannot evaluate relative to yourself the full extent of harm that has been committed upon you because you're not supposed to ponder on this particular wrong. You're not supposed to ponder on what has been happening. You're supposed to forgive and move on. The second thing is that people convince themselves that they've forgiven another person, but Oftentimes, that's not true. What you say doesn't match the subconscious. And that's why people build resentment towards individuals and they don't know this is the case because they think they've forgiven them. And that's only because society at large tells them that they have and that they should have, but they haven't really. And that's why you have very negative feelings and emotions towards people who you could have had good relationships with, and you could have potentially built a better connection with as well. But you don't, because you feel that inherent feeling of resentment that you were forced too early to forgive this person, and you never thought of a way that things could have been better. Now, let me deal with the comparative here a little bit. I am more than willing to acknowledge that I think the narrative is what has enabled a lot of rehabilitation to occur at large. So the way that we interact with people try to become better because they know they can be forgiven. I'm willing to accept that, but I'm going to explain why that's a horrible thing. The first thing is that and I'm talking about the perspective of a perpetrator here, which is that oftentimes I think the ways in which that they try to gain forgiveness because they're so compelled by society is oftentimes quite damaging to a victim as well, right? This is stuff like posting incendiary Facebook messages about how much of a horrible person you are and how you want to change, but that doesn't take into account how the victim feels about that publication of that particular post. The second thing is that oftentimes it requires for you to seek forgiveness from this person. This means messaging them, talking to them as much as possible, making sure that you're interacting with them as much as possible in order to gain this forgiveness. This is terrible because it puts victims in an uncomfortable position where they have to sacrifice their privacy or their own personal feelings, or just being uncomfortable and interacting with someone that really fucked you over is a horrible thing to subject victims to. The virtue that the narrative that forgiveness is a virtue forces victims to deal with more of that. But the second thing is this, and this is where I kind of deal with what the alternative in our world is. Perpetrators try too hard to be forgiven, and sometimes you won't be forgiven. Sometimes the crime you've committed is just too drastic. Sometimes you are not going to get any form of an outcome from a victim for reasons that they may personally have. The problem with this is that because rehabilitation is so tied to the end outcome of you being forgiven, many people that are along the pathway of becoming better oftentimes give up because there's no point in me renouncing my alcoholism because the daughter I estranged will never re-enter my life to begin with. There's no point for me trying to become a better person, to mind my language, or become a more equitable person, because the ultimate outcome of recovery will never be something that I'm given to begin with. That's why on a comparative, the type of rehabilitation we have in our world is stuff that doesn't focus on getting external validation from individuals. It's not about getting forgiveness, it's about fixing yourself. As long as you fix the alcoholism problem you have, your lying, any kind of negative tendency, that's sufficient. Because you made a mistake, you may not have been forgiven, but that's fine. You can recover. That's the world opening government is proud to defend. Thank you.
We thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech and call upon the Leader of the Opposition to open the debate for opposition side. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I audible? All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. The reason in status quo, all ethics, religious or non-religious, have consensus regarding forgiveness being a virtue. Literally, the wisdom and intellect of billions of people have a consensus. It's because it helps victims move on, it leads to better social cohesion, and it improves the reform of perpetrators. All of this would directly clash with what OG talked about, so I'll largely just be integrating rebuttal. The one thing I want to note, however, before I go on, is I am unsure as to why in their world you will magically not require external validation. Social relations will still be important in their world insofar as you actually harm somebody you care about, and that's why you actually wanted that forgiveness in order to reform in the first place. You will probably still want some sort of improvement of social relations on their side of the house as well. The problem then is you don't get those improvements of social relations. That daughter will never come back to you at all in all cases. And insofar as, while in some cases you don't get forgiven and you don't have an incentive to reform, on their side of the house you have no incentive to reform, largely speaking, but not completely no, insofar as you don't actually get the improvement in social relations. So with that, I'll just go on to my positive case. One, why is this belief important insofar as large amounts of forgiveness to occur? I think OG's already analyzed this to some extent, but largely it's because at the point at which a violation happens to you, you usually respond in anger. It's the first biological impulse of your body gives, because something personal, some effort for you was not valued, something personal was let's say violated, or insofar as it's just the easiest response to give and to respond in anger. In that moment, you're not thinking as rationally as they want to do so. So that it clashes directly with their point about, oh, forgiveness is not always rational, because the counter of action is also not always also rational either. That thus a strong belief via socialization, pop culture, ethics, religion, or non-religious ethics is important to ensure that you have more amount of forgiveness on our side of the house. I'll clarify why that's important in just a bit. Two clarifications before I go on. Firstly, in the case of the absolute worst case crimes, where you have something of the case of sexual assault or something horrible like that, you don't have forgiveness even on our side of the house, insofar as people probably don't want to forgive that person despite the beliefs. So I don't think that's part of the debate. The second thing is, often forgiveness requires the other person to undergo one of two things. One, a serious indication or some indication of reform, because you're not going to forgive someone if they literally have no shame for what they did. Forgiveness requires a prerequisite for them to asking to be forgiven, saying that they're sorry, saying that they'll change, or actually showing that change. That's why reform is easier. But secondly, if not that, it requires some sort of punishment or punitive measure, insofar as you actually feel that, okay, I can forgive this person now. So it's not like you don't have reform of that sort or retribution of that sort on our side of the house. One, why is forgiveness and more forgiveness important? The first thing I'm going to talk about how it's important to victims. I think I've already analyzed you insofar as a violation occurs. The victims often on their side of the house will respond, on both sides, will respond to anger. It's the easiest biological mechanism. You often feel hurt by something, and the initial response is to respond with hostility and anger. This anger often clouds your judgment. It's kind of being biologically shown. Even the courts do state that if insofar as you are really angry, those are extenuating circumstances, because there's this consensus that anger ensures that you cannot rationally comprehend the situation. That's bad, because you can two things can happen. The first thing, that anger can motivate you to go towards large forms of revenge. Now, this is particularly harmful. This can lead to social exclusion or distancing. So, for example, in the case they provide themselves, if you don't forgive your uncle, I'm not sure how it happens with brown families in Malaysia, but brown families in Pakistan would just beat the shit out of you for not forgiving your uncle, for being angry or having revenge or taking revenge on your uncle. Insofar as that's important, like you can't actually take revenge in lots of cases. You'll actually face lots of social exclusion or even legal ramifications. Insofar as you go for extreme cases like actually hurting the other person or committing crimes against the other person, because you think that is the way you'll get better, to actually seek revenge of that sort rather than simply forgiving that simple person. That revenge is much less on our side of the house insofar as you think forgiveness is something that can allow you to move on in the first place. The second thing is, often in the vast majority of cases, you often can't take revenge. There are structures against you, structures of power, also legal structures, or all those issues. All of that means that you are helpless. And what happens then? I think the first thing that happens is you're just going to simply languish in that anger. Why so? Because it's difficult to forget what happened to you. Forgetting is way more difficult than forgiveness. One, because you don't control your brain's response, but largely also because there are vast social reminders. There might be social reminders in terms of conversations that come up, in terms of a friend that's not part of your friend circle anymore, or anything that's somewhat triggering. All of that basically means you cannot forget that this incident occurred, but you don't have any positive or feelings or anything to mitigate all of the revenge or anger that you're possibly feeling. In that, you just languish in it. In the vast majority of cases, understand most of the words were populous, the poor, the developing world, where you don't have legal ramifications, you never get any sort of, let's say, justice or any sort of reform that they talk to you about. You have no way to ensure that you feel better. How do we ensure that on our side of the house? One, insofar as forgiveness is painted out to be a virtue, at the point of which you forgive someone, it makes you feel really good. It makes you feel like the bigger person. It makes you feel like the more moral person. It makes you feel like you did the right thing. Even if that's completely untrue, that feeling of positivity is so important to a victim who suffered lots of negativity. But that also, what forgiveness also, the belief right now ensures, is that there's some sort of closure. You've forgiven the other person. The case is largely settled. You don't have to worry or think about it anymore. You've forgiven it. It's done, you can move on. Insofar as that's true, you get lots of closure. You don't actually have to continue to languish in that anger. The impacts of this are twofold. One, lots of mental health benefits insofar as perhaps everything's not perfect, sure, but you actually have that positive feeling that you did the right thing and you can actually move on further. That's particularly important given that the vast majority of the world cannot access mental health services. They don't have therapists. They have to continue to go to their job. They have to continue to be in places where they might have to look at the victim again, so that the perpetrator again. Let's say if they're in their family or they're in the workforce. They don't have those sort of liberty for those options. Forgiveness then helps them move on, helps them get past what happened so they can actually continue to be productive, get that money, all those sorts of things. A POI in closing, if they have one?
I think this seems like a false comparative. You don't have to forgive someone in order to move on or to avoid your abusers or to, where possible, seek justice against him. So I don't see how you get any marginal benefits on your side.
Well, maybe not all cases, but like I did analyze for you why it's difficult to forget. I also did analyze for you in the vast majority of cases it's difficult to get justice, to like punish them legally. Most of the developing world with weak legal systems, most of the people who are poor, all of those reasons, maybe they'll have to analyze them further. But also mental health is extremely important. So far as you're busy languishing on this and hating them for this, it's likely to seep into your life, your job, your grades, all of those sorts of things that are extremely crucial. The second thing then is there are large societal benefits in two forms. The first is just generally in collective forms. Sure, some evils like the Holocaust will not be forgiven, but lots of evils that societies and communities at large have faced need to be forgiven for them to move on, for them to ensure there are social and economic cohesive benefits, and then there is less conflict. I'll give you the examples of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee in South Africa, of FARC, if it had work and stuff of that sort. This is particularly crucially important, because this particularly means that these communities in the comparative would not have been able to forgive the perpetrators of historical injustices. What that essentially means, you never had that societal and social integration in the first place. That is crucial for all of the economic benefits, for all of the trade, and for the fact that you stop the conflict in the first place. Taha will analyze more about how it reforms the perpetrators, but so proud to oppose.
We thank the leader of the opposition for that fine speech and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for government side. Hear, hear.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you. The reason why the side of op will lose this bid is because they were completely uncomparative to the things that Navin told you. It may be true that eventually, maybe perhaps victims want to forgive, maybe victims want to reconcile. But the point is, in our world, they can individualize closure for themselves. Even if they decide to be angry, even if they decide to ghost the person, even if they decide to move to another country, even if they decide to disown their family members, the fact of the matter is they don't feel as if forgiveness is inherently a good thing, and they don't feel as if they need to do that in order to move on. You create an artificial standard for victims that had no ability to consent into this standard, and as a sorry, my speaker. Yes, and as a result, you make things far, far worse for them. What will I do in this speech? Okay, sorry, there's an echo. Sorry, yeah, I just stopped my timer. Let me just.
Okay, turn it off. Okay, is it off?
Yeah.
Hey, no, I still hear the echo.
Hello? Oh, no, it's your computer.
Oh, okay. Okay, continue.
My apologies. Can I continue? Two questions I'll answer in this bit. The first, how does this impact victims? And the second, how does this impact perpetrators? Firstly, let's talk about victims. The one response the leader of opposition has to our speech is that you don't require external validation, and is that the leader of opposition suggests that you still need external validation in our world. But Navin gives you a couple of structural reasons why forgiveness often means that perpetrators also feel the need to be forgiven and thus harass the victim. One, it is framed as a necessary tool in dispute resolution. That is to say, yes, forgiveness may be the virtue, but that means in order for perpetrators to also move on, in order for perpetrators to have resolved the dispute, they need to be forgiven. And as a result, they are likely to do things to seek that forgiveness, like harass victims, like constantly message them, because they feel as if their only way to move on, or the only way for society to view them as the same, is to seek forgiveness from the victim. Second is not the nuance Naveen gives you. The reason why forgiveness is a virtue is because it is often connotated to victims letting go, to victims no longer feeling the same pain, the same trauma that they initially felt. And the problem with this is that victims can no longer express this trauma, talk about it in social spaces, because they are seen as if that they already need to move on. The comparative is you can alternate between forgiving someone and between being angry with someone. You can retract your forgiveness at any time. You can do whatever the hell you like, because this is how you process your own feelings, grief, and trauma. And there's no premium on how you should do it. You don't force victims to feel like they need to let go. But even if I were to accept the premise that we require external validation in our world as well, note that I think if perpetrators want to rehabilitate, they no longer feel as if they need to be forgiven by the victim. That means they can seek external validation through therapy. They can seek external validation through their friends. Oh, but all these things mean that they don't have to go to the victim and make the victim's life worse in order to improve their own lives to begin with. For all these reasons, I think one, you are less likely to require external validation in our world, thus you harm victims less. But even if you need external validation, you are likely to not harm the victim, as you're likely to be able to do it yourself. Second question I want to answer is, how should victims act? Because they make this bunch of ridiculous assertions in their speech, right? The first one I want to get out of the way is this whole idea about revenge. One, I just think revenge is so unrealistic. Like, there are legal safeguards against it. There are moral safeguards. The fact that like you doing something horrible to another person also means that you're probably equally guilty of the crime. Secondly, considering the context from OO themselves, that victims want to maintain this idea of like moral superiority, the point in which they act back probably means they lose their moral superiority, probably means they lose their idea of victimhood, and all these things means that there are natural checks and balances to not attack back. But even if I were to accept that victims take revenge, how are they likely to take revenge? I think, considering they're like legal safeguards, right, which deter people from going to jail, and moral safeguards from doing really horrible things, maybe they'll make a Facebook post, maybe they'll shame people online. And all these things, I think, are legitimate forms of catharsis for these individuals to do. They should be allowed to do these things. They should be allowed to seek revenge in their own way. And as a result, I don't think the comparative is vigilante justice. I think it's more likely to be personalized, small forms of revenge that allow them to feel slightly better, even if revenge happens, which I already tell you revenge is unlikely to happen. The second thing they say is that victims are likely to languish in anger. One, they assert this is bad. I think anger is inherently a very cathartic thing. Every time you feel anger, you feel as if you feel stronger. You feel as if you feel power at the fact you're able to be angry, you're able to see this person as a perpetrator. No, I think there's a unique benefit in being able to see this perpetrator as completely evil and not having to sympathize with that individual, which I think forgiveness forces you to do. Because Naveen tells you that forgiving inherently often requires being nostalgic or romanticizing the things that happen, often means that you have to brush over the pure psychological trauma that individual gave you in order to feel like you're at a point where you need to forgive. The comparative is this cathartic anger that doesn't require you to sympathize with the perpetrator. Secondly, even if it's not anger, there are many alternatives, right? There can be anger, you can ghost the person, you can do whatever it is you want. The comparative in our is you can individualize closure. So I think it's so forgiveness-centric the way they envision the world. In our, perhaps you can still reconcile. Perhaps the way we reconcile now means forgiveness is no longer a prerequisite to reconciliation. I can still be angry at you for what you did, and we can still be somewhat acquaintances. But that's not the point. The point is, regardless of whether victims want to reconcile, don't want to reconcile, want to forgive, don't want to forgive, there is no undue and unnecessary pressure on them to opt into one decision before they are ready to make that decision. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from closing off.
Look, you talk about perpetrators and victims quite a lot, but the vast majority of forgiving that you do in your life happens with people who haven't attacked you, but people who like stole your sandwich, or a friend that you got into a fight with. You also have to argue for why you shouldn't try to forgive individuals in your life that aren't criminals, are just your family and friends.
So one, that's a ridiculous assertion. Two, I think the people that are most important in this debate are the people that have had the most harm done onto them. So maybe there are less rape victims, but rape victims' forgiveness is a lot more important because the harm and trauma is a lot more than someone stealing your freaking sandwich. Thirdly, I think that's a horrible characterization. That is to say, like, I think stealing your sandwich maybe too far on one extreme, maybe like horrible things like sexual assault is on another extreme. But in our, I think like all these things are very subjective in nature. The comparative is when there's no inherent virtue on something, because these things are so subjective, individuals can personalize these things and individualize closure to them based on how they feel about the crime. That means like you stealing a ring from me may not be that bad in the eyes of the justice system, but maybe that was the last heirloom my grandmother gave me. The point is that crimes are personal in nature and victims should be able to deal with them however they see fit. The last thing I think Navin tells you, which isn't really, but before that, what is the weighing, right? Because I think they say that feeling positive is a good thing. One, feeling positive initially is very temporary. It doesn't mean that you deal with your long-term trauma. Navin tells you you're more likely to deal with your long-term trauma when the initial feeling of goodness you want to hold on to. Because being a good person or being positive doesn't mean you deal with the trauma you went through, doesn't mean you're able to process it. The comparative in our is when you feel anger, when you're allowed to like alternate between different states of like forgiveness or anger or whatever, you're able to then decide what you want to do. You're able to then go through your trauma one by one and heal and reconcile with it in the best way you deem possible. For all these reasons, we take this debate. Thank you very much.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech and call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close out the opening half of this debate. Hear, hear.
Yeah, so just to be clear, my internet connection isn't the most stable one. So if I, if there's any sort of interference or anything, just signal and stop.
Want us to turn the cameras off or something to like make it easier on your connection? Does that help?
If I stop video, does that make it better? Okay, I'm going to start in a few. Side-opening government has a very weird frame for this debate. They think forgiveness is a free-for-all, in that they think that once you have this belief that forgiveness is a virtue, everybody just willy-nilly goes out into the street and starts forgiving everybody. We say yes, obviously there's an effect of the belief in that lots of people are encouraged to forgive other people based on it. But we say that the belief in and of itself is not a sufficient condition to forgive every single sort of thing. The second thing that Essen told you crucially, which has not been engaged with, is that for you to gain forgiveness, you must see actions on part of the perpetrator that suggests that that perpetrator is trying to change, that that perpetrator is sorry for their actions, and therefore you must forgive them. Why is this a crucial frame and why is this true? Because Essen told you that forgiveness is unlikely to accrue for a number of reasons, just in terms of our emotional response. One, you have been personally harmed by a person. This can look like somebody stealing your food or somebody violating your autonomy. This can range to a lot of things, right? But the point is something that had personal meaning for you has been stripped away from you and you have been wronged. The emotional response to that is obviously going to be one of pain and one of anger because you have just lost something. That, I think, in and of itself means that forgiveness is unlikely because the first instinct is to harm the other person or wish the worst for them at the very least. The second reason why we told you why forgiveness is already unlikely in the status quo is because there are so many social reminders of the kind of harm that has been accrued on you. The fact that, for instance, your friend is there in front of you, the person who violated you, for instance, or your family uncle is still there, even if that uncle, for instance, abused you, or that person is still in school, or so on and so forth, right? So it's very difficult to get away from reminders of the harm that was accrued. And the last thing I would just point out is the reason why forgiveness doesn't happen in all instances is because there are sometimes incentives to pursue punishment. So for instance, in the cases of like say criminal justice cases, you can get punishments for the perpetrator. They can be extremely cathartic if you see someone going to jail. So that's one reason for why you don't always forgive these people, but also you can have financial incentives such as going to court and getting like a financial settlement or a financial penalty on somebody and then getting all of this money. The reason why all of this is important then is that forgiveness is not just some like irrational thing that happens out of nowhere. There is a thought process that goes into it, and then there are benefits that accrue off it. So all of their ideas of like, you know, there's no consent into this and so on and so forth, I don't believe they're framing just on the outset. There are three things I want to talk about in this speech. One, I want to talk about personal benefits. Two, I'm going to talk about communities. And three, I'm going to talk about perpetrators. Just on regards of personal benefits, we told you two things and I don't think that we've received responses to those actually. The first instinct could be, and this is one scenario where the victim or whoever's been wronged is acting out, right? Because obviously for reasons I've already given you above, there are two kinds of responses that you can do. One, in terms of your social interactions, like DPM suggested, you can perhaps either go on Facebook and write a long rant or whatever. I think the problem with the social interactions and anger bit on their side is when you are angry, even if the reasons for your anger are valid, you are not necessarily thinking about things like, is my action, which is seeking to harm the other person, proportional to the crime that they committed or proportional to the wrong that they committed? So I think in their world, one, there's obviously an escalation of conflict because people have reasons to enact revenge on each other. But two, I would posit that lots of people get screwed over much more than they would on the converse because they are going to be disproportionately affected for things that they have done, and therefore it's a wrong thing. I think the second thing is also just in terms of social interaction, the reason why anger is not a positive thing like DPM suggested is because anger manifests itself not only in your social interactions with the perpetrator, but also in your social interactions with your friends. In a state where you are angry, you are not necessarily thinking about hurting only the X person. It is about causing hurt because you have been hurt yourself. I think that this is extremely bad for victims because at the point at which they start having like anger management issues, which their friends then have to suffer the consequences of, they lose friends or they start being unpleasant people who newer friends that they might have had don't want to come talk to. And I think that this is a huge problem for victims on their side of the house, something that they don't consider. The second thing that we point out is in the worst kinds of cases, you are you are encouraged to enact revenge on your own, and this can lead to vigilante justice. And notice, vigilante justice is an important thing in this debate because lots of people around the world do not have access to mechanisms of justice like SN told you. Poor people cannot afford courts. The police are biased against certain races. And I think that this is an extremely big harm on their side of the house. The problem then is not only with regards to vigilante justice, but also because of the fact that oftentimes victims have to face legal repercussions for the actions that they take out of revenge. The second thing I want to note is in terms of what happens in the scenario where you don't act out. And SN again told you this with little to no response from DPM, right? There are reasons for why you cannot forget the harm that was done to you. It is not as if you just go to therapy and move on, because look, all of their mechanisms are, well, you either become angry or you go to therapy. We've given you reasons for why therapy is not accessible to everyone, but also why anger is bad. And if forgetting is not something that can happen easily, we say, given that you can't act out because other people oftentimes have more power than you, are more popular than you, have more money than you, loads of reasons, you are likely to languish in this anger. Before moving on, I'll take closing, but if nothing from closing, I'll take opening.
Your benefits of perpetrators having to do things to gain forgiveness is something we say is a harm because it inherently requires victims' constant participation. Our burden is not to prove that forgiveness is bad, but to prove that it should not be the overarching standard for individuals.
Okay, I just get to it. But before I get to that, the only reason I want to point out is mental health is that you don't get on their side because you don't have access to lots of therapy. But I would also point out that the reason why forgiveness is extremely important is because it restores power in a situation where you never had power to begin with. You were wronged, but forgiveness gives you the ability to control the situation that you find yourself in, and that's why it is extremely cathartic, and there are long-term effects. It's not as if you forgive someone, feel good for 2 days, and then it all comes back to you. I would point out that this is more of a permanent thing. Now let's talk about perpetrators because these guys want to talk about them. I would point out that one, in our world, we have incentives for perpetrators to try to change, which is a good thing because it prevents future acts of violation against other people that you would otherwise see. But then why are perpetrators much worse under their model? I would just point out, like note panel, that in their world, forgiveness still exists as something, right? Perpetrators have an incentive to get forgiveness because that means that they don't have to give, go through legal penalties or give lots of money to their victims. And that's why in their model, if forgiveness is even more difficult to get, then all of the things that they're talking about become much worse. So you trying to remain in contact with the victim, trying to text them even more for forgiveness happens much more in a world where there's a higher bar for forgiveness, where you must do more to prove that you need to be forgiven. And I think that if that is the problem, then opening government intensifies this. And lastly, I would just point out that if it is difficult for individuals to give up anger and sadness, it is more difficult for communities to do the same. Essence point about why communities are much more likely in our world to forgive other communities and live in social cohesion was not engaged with. Very proud to oppose.
We thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for that fine speech and call upon the Member of Government to continue to the second half of this debate. Hear, hear.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Starting in 3, 2, 1. I think a couple of clarifications need to be made with regard to opening opposition's case. Firstly, they conflate the idea of forgiveness with the idea of moving on. I think it is entirely possible for people to move on because they realize that nothing can be done about their perpetrators in the short term, but that doesn't mean they forgive them, and that's a crucial difference. It leaves open the door for your righteous anger to be able to hold them accountable decades later during the Me Too movement, for example, for sexual crimes committed in, let's say, the 1980s. But it also ensures that you don't take the broader issue of, let's say, sexual abuse or mistreatment of women lying down, and that you will dedicate the rest of your life towards fixing these things, or at least not tolerate it in your presence. So it is possible to move on without forgiving, and I therefore think that most of the benefits that Bo talks about with regard to your personal well-being and mental health evaporate as a result. The second thing is that forgiveness, they admit, of course, that forgiveness is not something that ought to be practiced all the time. But they also need to defend the idea that when you have forgiveness as a virtue that is embedded in a belief on the part of most of the population, forgiveness becomes the norm. It has to be implemented in the vast majority of instances. That's a whole different thing from saying, we think forgiveness is conditionally useful some of the time, because it means you are basically exercising forgiveness in many more instances where it might not be appropriate to do so. 3 layers of extension as a result. The first of which is that the forgiveness ought not to be a virtue, and perhaps we ought to move away from the idea of virtues in the first place. So opening house is a bit of a deadlock, right? Because there are clearly some instances in which forgiveness is good and some instances in which forgiveness may be a bad thing. The way we break the deadlock is by examining not the idea of forgiveness, but the idea of what virtue is. And OG briefly mentions this in the first 30 seconds of the speech, but let's elaborate on it further. The thing with virtues is that they are generally meant to be unconditional. So for example, when we talk about filial piety as a virtue that most Asian families are supposed to practice, we think it ought to be A, either unconditional, B, and then universal, or at the very least B, that it is the default way by which we govern our lives. And this applies, of course, to most of the non-serious cases that warrant forgiveness that CEO talks about, right? If you talk about honesty, for example, these things ought to be unconditional, because they are virtues. The problem is that very few things deserve to be called virtues, because I think the opening house analysis has already sufficiently shown that forgiveness can be very thorny and perhaps actively counterproductive in a whole variety of situations involving interpersonal relations and even in the areas of social change. So perhaps the solution is not to have forgiveness as a virtue, but to simply classify it as something that might be conditionally useful from a utilitarian perspective. Let's not try to bring virtue ethics into this. But maybe, I think, and I think one other way in which you can determine whether something ought to be virtuous or not is to see whether it will be a good thing to be universalizable. I don't think forgiveness ought to be universalized, right? In the same way, incorruptibility ought to be universalized. A world where everyone is incorruptible is probably a good thing. But a world in which everyone is forgiving merely opens the way for predators to be able to exploit people in a variety of instances. That's not necessarily a good thing. So if you want the philosophical basis by which you determine what is a virtue and what is not, I think forgiveness is not one of those virtues. Secondly, belief. So the problem with beliefs is that they're not constructed neutrally. So even if we buy the idea that forgiveness can be a virtue, the conditions that create these beliefs were never neutral in the first place. So the institutions that propagate the idea that certain virtues ought to be upheld also have their own vested interest in mind. When I am told to be filial, engage in filial piety as a virtue, the people telling me have a vested interest, aka my parents, my family, my wider community, to ensure that parents get a free pass whenever they do something that might potentially be abusive or rather conservative. And frankly speaking, we therefore cannot trust these institutions to prescribe to us what virtues ought to uphold. The same way forgiveness is preached by mosques and churches whenever religious leaders are found guilty of perhaps embezzlement or even sexual abuse, right? There is an